We're very excited today to have two speakers. Today's session is focused on salinity and water quality in general, and we're very excited to have two speakers from Israel, two young researchers that have long futures ahead of them, and we're hoping that they will stay active in avocado research. Before I introduce the first of the two speakers, I want to tell you that we will be having a third session on irrigation aspects of for avocados. That will be hosted by Ben Faber, and that'll be held in just about a month. We'll be sending out an announcement. Ben doesn't have a firm date yet, but that topic will be on water delivery systems and designing irrigation systems for your growth. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, David Yalin. David is a postdoc at the Weizmann Institute and in a laboratory that actually specializes in ecophysiology of forest crops. But he did his PhD and bachelor's at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. And for his PhD, he looked at root zone levels of oxygen in wastewater irrigated orchards planted in heavy soils, and worked to understand what that did to trees. He has two very nice publications that have been posted on Avocado Source if after the talk that you would like to actually look at. So without further ado, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity. I'll start sharing my screen. Okay, hope everybody sees it well.
Yeah.
Good. So as Melu mentioned, it's been a while since I've been working on avocados. It's been 2 years, and I hope that I'm still fresh on this topic enough to answer all your questions. And I'll be starting with a very broad overview of irrigation with treated wastewater from our Israeli perspective. And I hope that won't wear you down, because I'll end up with speaking about why you avocado growers should care about treated wastewater and its implications on irrigation, on the crops. And these are a few photos to get you already curious to what treated wastewater does to crops, to avocado crops. So I'm giving an Israeli perspective because Israel is considered a world leader in irrigation with treated wastewater. So as you can see here, I'll just move to a laser pointer. Israel uses a lot of its limited water resources for agriculture, and out of the chunk that of water that's required for agriculture, we now supply about an equal amount of TW of treated wastewater to the amount of fresh water we supply to agriculture. And that's a big chunk of agriculture, of our agriculture, that is irrigated with this water. Now, this has been part of a strategic move of Israel towards use of treated wastewater. During the 1980s, we had a few droughts that led the country to understand that if we want to supply water regularly to agriculture, we're going to have to rely on wastewater as well for this. And it allows us a big supply of water and a reliable supply of water. And this, of course, is an advantage. Here you can see an image of one of the great facilities in Israel of water treatment that supplies the water to the south of Israel from the Tel Aviv area. So it's a convenient solution to Israel, not only because we have water shortage, as you have also in California, I imagine, in these years, but also it's very convenient because in Israel, our population is concentrated along the coast in this narrow strip. Tel Aviv, for reference, is here, and Jerusalem is here. Just to give you a scale, from here up to here, it's about 200 kilometers. So we're not a big country. And in the same area where our population is most dense, where most of the sewage production is happening, we also have most of our irrigated farming. This green areas of irrigated farming is also concentrated in the same areas, and that makes it very convenient that we don't have to pump the wastewater to a long distance. I understand that in California it's very different, where you have the concentration of population in one area and agriculture in another area, and that's a bit of a challenge. But water stress is not something unique to Israel, and a lot of the world is driven towards reuse of wastewater. These are maps from the FAO. In some areas, reuse of water looks like this, as it does in Mexico, where crude sewage, raw sewage, without any treatment is driven into the fields and irrigated with it. But that's not the case here in Israel. Here in Israel, we're doing treatment of the wastewater prior to irrigation, and this is what I'll be focusing on. So I'll start with talking a bit about treated wastewater quality and what determines it, and then I'll be talking about the implications for agriculture. So Asano, in a book that talks all about treated wastewater, gives this schematical diagram where we're describing relative water quality as a function of time, not to scale, very generalized. And what you can see is that the quality of water is very variable. We can have, and it depends first of all on the source water. It starts with the source water, which can be of high quality or poorer quality. Then the water is treated and used as drinking water. It's drinking water quality. And then after municipal or industrial use, it goes down to the quality of wastewater. And what this use is will determine how bad is the wastewater. So, of course, if we're just using it for tap water, for washing clothes, or for if we're using it for industrial uses, it will bring the wastewater to a different level of quality. And then during the treatment process, we can raise the quality to a certain degree up to getting to treated wastewater, or even raising the quality up to a level of drinking water as well in some treatment levels. So this is a general view of the quality pathway. And you can deduce based on what pathway your water goes through to what quality water you'll get in the treated wastewater. So starting at the source, you can imagine home use and where the water comes from. And this is data from the US. So you can imagine that if 24% of the water comes from toilets, what it will look like. And if it comes from faucets, what it would look like compared to that. And that determines what we get in the sewage. So one extreme example where it isn't residential use is an example of the Intel manufacturing plant here in Israel, where they produce the microchips of Intel. And there the wastewater is very rich in boron and potassium. So boron might be a nutrient for you, and that can be great to have that in the water source. But in Israel, the boron concentrations, because of such uses, got to toxic levels, and that should be considered. Potassium, on the other hand, can be beneficial, of course, as a nutrient, but also that can be in excess if we have a plant that's pumping a lot of that. So the first thing we should consider in the quality is the source of the wastewater. And to kind of give you an idea what's in the wastewater itself. So this is crude wastewater prior to treatment. And just to mention a few things that are in there. So we've got these dissolved solids, which can be a lot of organic matter, which is this BOD, this biological, we measure the organic matter according to biological oxygen demand. And that means, of course, that we also have a lot of pathogens like coliforms and things like that. So that's one aspect that we should consider if it's in the wastewater. Another aspect that we should consider in the wastewater is the fact that we have there nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium that you all know as plant nutrients, sulfate, calcium, magnesium, plant nutrients, but also minerals which are toxic to the plant, such as this chloride and sodium, and as I mentioned, boron, which we in Israel consider now as a toxic element, more as a nutrient. So these are things that are in the wastewater, and that the treatment process has to deal with and to relate to. And just to give a taster, the treatment process usually includes some sedimentation to get rid of some rough solids, to get rid of sand, which is reaching the wastewater. And then the wastewater goes through aeration pumps that are meant to get rid of the harmful bacteria, take down the levels of organic matter so that it's not so supportive of harmful bacteria, and get it to levels that we want to use for agriculture. So here in Israel, we've got, since I believe 2010, we've got the INBAL regulations, which tell us what is the quality of water for unlimited irrigation. And basically, we've got very good infrastructure controlling that all our wastewater goes through this treatment process that will allow it to reach these levels. So there's a top level of organic matter, which is allowed, limited by the biological oxygen demand, the chemical oxygen demand. There's a limit to the harmful bacteria that are allowed in it. And these limitations also speak about the maximum nitrogen and phosphorus concentration that is allowed in the water. And that's to prevent harmful environmental impacts, of course, of these nutrients, which I'm sure you're aware of. And also top limits to these three elements, which I mentioned, which we know here in Israel to be already damaging to plants. And I'll mention damage related to sodium, and Silit, which will speak after me, I think will speak about both sodium and chloride and their damage to plants. And so if the regulator decided on actually putting limits of these elements to secure the agriculture downstream. Now, human safety is really not an expertise of mine, but I just thought that if I give a broad overview, I'll mention a couple of topics. So first of all, treated wastewater, is it safe to use in agriculture? So there's an ISO regulation as to how to use treated wastewater and what wastewater quality is right for what use. And what you can see here is an image from a playground where my kids play in. And one of the things that we do here in Israel to secure that there won't be contamination between treated wastewater and fresh water, drinking water, is that we use purple pipes for treated wastewater. And you can see that next to where my kids are playing, we're using treated wastewater. So when the quality of the treated wastewater is high enough, we need zero barriers between the treated wastewater and workers or people, or in this case, even children. But of course, that if we have less treated wastewater or crude wastewater, we either need certain barriers to keep the wastewater away from our agricultural workers and from the fruit, or with raw wastewater, we want to keep it absolutely away from the fruit. And there's a lot of cases I showed in the beginning, the case of Mexico, where they use raw wastewater, and there's a lot of cases of illnesses where that is used. So in the sense of infection with harmful bacteria or other parasites, the better we treat the wastewater, the less risk we have, and the less we have to keep a distance between that and the workers. But we can get to treated wastewater quality that is high enough not to cause any health hazards. Another issue which is just I thought would be interesting for you to hear of is the matter of contaminants of emerging concern. So this is a picture out of a publication of my colleague Tomer Malchi, who in his group they asked what happens when people consume drugs and even benevolent drugs such as Viagra or carbamazepine, which is used as an anti-convulsion medicine. If those drugs reach the sewage and the treatment process, do they go back to the agriculture when we irrigate with the treated sewage? And do we then consume those drugs? So this is work that's being done right now. In their publication of 2014, Tomer and his group didn't find harmful concentrations, but this is a topic which is still hot. And I'm guessing that as you transfer to use treated wastewater, and as people are more familiar with this topic, they will be kind of weary to ask, are we getting medicine when we're consuming avocados? And so that's just a hot topic that I thought was worth mentioning to you as farmers. Now to more agricultural topics, more agronomic topics. So let's look at treated wastewater as a source of fertilizer. So I'll examine treated wastewater as a source of fertilizer using the 4 R's criteria. Is it the right source of fertilizer? Is it coming in the right rate? Is it in the right time? And is it in the right place? So just to mention about nitrogen, this is work done by Bautal in 2010, a review job. And you can see that using the total nitrogen levels, most of which were in the ammoniacal form, both grapefruit, cotton and corn, and Bermuda grass and sorghum had a positive yield response to nitrogen supplied with the treated wastewater, and the nitrogen content in the leaves was appropriate. And I show these references for people which are curious to see more about this. So the nutrients come in a form which the plants can enjoy and do enjoy, an ammoniacal form that can go through transformation to nitrate in the soil, and in organic matter form. What about the rates of nitrogen? So just to give you a back of the envelope kind of calculation. So we can take the nitrogen concentration, which I told you was the Israeli limit, the 35 milligrams of nitrogen per liter allowed, and assume that we irrigate with 5,000 cubic meters per hectare of treated wastewater, and we can calculate like that how much nitrogen we add per year. And in the same way, we can calculate for different irrigation amounts and for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium with average values of treated wastewater. And what you can see is this great dependence between the irrigation amount and the fertilizer amount here. And this can be quite tricky because if we have a water requirement of 7,000 cubic meters per hectare, we might be applying too much phosphorus, for example. But if we're irrigating with much less, we might be deficient on nitrogen or on phosphorus or on potassium. So this is quite tricky, the amount of nutrients, but I do think it's important for each of you to account for these nutrients. Another thing that's tricky is, are we giving the nutrients in the right time? So this is a schematic calculation done by Jorge Totzitsky with treated wastewater of high nitrogen levels. And he did this just as a demonstration that we might be giving small amounts of irrigation with treated wastewater during April here in Israel, supplying very little nitrogen from effluent, where with fertilizer we would have added much more nitrogen. Meaning that in April, for example, our trees might be deficient in nitrogen. And on the other hand, around August, we might not be wanting to give any nitrogen as fertilizer, but we'll be irrigating with a lot of effluent, meaning that we've got a lot of excess nitrogen during this period where the trees might not be enjoying it so much. So that's another disadvantage of irrigation with treated wastewater, is the fact that we might not be giving the nutrients in the right time for the trees to enjoy. So looking at the 4 R's, we are giving the right source of fertilizer. The trees do enjoy the fertilizer. We might be giving the right rate at certain periods of the year, but not on other periods of the year. And regarding the placing, if we're irrigating with drip irrigation, we might be placing it just in the right space, and that might be beneficial. And that's a summary of that. And just to remind you, and again, this is from our poor experience in Israel, is what is the cost of applying too much nitrogen. These are nitrate concentrations here on the right in our groundwater. These are wells along our most inhabited area in Israel. And you can see that in many areas where agriculture is happening next to the groundwater, we have excessive rates of nitrates in the groundwater, and those can be very harmful for health. So we should consider, of course, the nutritional benefits of the treated wastewater for the trees, and we should account for them when we're making our calculations on how much fertilizer to apply. And this is a blue baby syndrome that's always referred to when we talk about excess nitrates in groundwater. So I'll conclude. I hope I left enough time to speak about my own research about avocados and why you should care about treated wastewater. And the motivation to my PhD work was these findings from Israel. So what you can see here is the yield of treated wastewater irrigated orchards as compared to freshwater irrigated orchards. These were controlled experiments on citrus in Mizrah in Israel, on avocado in acres in Israel, and avocado in another point in Israel in Kiryat Eyal. And these are the years from irrigation, from the commence of irrigation with treated wastewater. And what you can see is that while in the first years of irrigation with treated wastewater, there were some beneficial results. 5 or more years after starting with that irrigation, we see detrimental effects on the plants, meaning a decline in yield. And in the orchard that I was working on in acres, we saw 30 or 40% decline in yield of the treated wastewater irrigated avocado as compared to freshwater irrigated avocado. And I know Silit will be speaking a lot about rootstock. So the most extreme damage was observed in the VC66 rootstock, surprisingly, and in Hass avocado. And that's what we chose to focus on in our research. Now, we asked ourselves, why is the damage happening in clay soils? So I didn't emphasize this enough. This damage was observed in clay soils, and research that was done in sandy soils did not see any damage to the trees, or damage was not reported in general. So when we asked ourselves, why is damage happening in clay soils, one of the things we know is that high sodium levels that we know are typical of treated wastewater are known to have impacts on the soil structure. So when we take a soil and we add to it a lot of sodium, what can happen due to sodicity, and this is a lot of work that's been done in Riverside and in Davis, is damage to the soil structure, meaning that the aggregates that should allow water flow between them are destroyed, and instead of having these big macropores that allow water to flow into the soil, we have these little tiny micropores where water hardly seeps into the soil. And this is a typical image from a pear orchard where I worked, showing that the drip water doesn't infiltrate the soil, and that's related most likely to this sodicity effect, especially amplified by the fact that we're still adding some organic matter which is clogging those micropores and not allowing the water to flow through them. So what we hypothesized was that the damage to the trees is happening from lack of oxygen to them. So what we believed is happening is that macropores, which should supply oxygen to the soils, are turning into these micropores and are being saturated, meaning that oxygen cannot effectively penetrate to where the roots need it at 10, 20 centimeters depth. And at the same time, we hypothesized that there's an increase in the oxygen demand due to the addition of bacteria, of organic matter that allows bacteria to grow around the roots. Now, just to emphasize this, plants need oxygen, especially avocado. And if there's one thing that I want you to take from this talk is this point. And this was recognized already by Virgil the poet in 29 BC. When he spoke about planting a vineyard, he said that you should dig in porous stones or rough shells, and that will allow fine air to steal in and for the sown plants to breathe. And this amazing understanding 2,000 years ago was shown very nicely in Riverside in California. This is work of Stolze from the 1960s, showing that avocado, this sensitive crop, looks much more miserable and can produce much less in the absence of oxygen. So oxygen is absolutely required for plants, and if treated wastewater affects it, then this is of course a source of damage to the plants. So I'll briefly show you some results because I see that my half hour is nearly over. So our research was done in Acre in the west of Israel, where we have very clay soils, 60% clay. We also worked on pear, which I won't show you today. And we installed these oxygen and soil water measurements, soil water tension measurements in the soil at 20 centimeters and 35 centimeters depth. This was installations performed by Professor Shmuel Asulin and his colleagues. And just to give you a look of what it looks like, these are the treated wastewater trees. This is the very clay soils while we installed solution samplers in them. This is what I looked like when I was 10 years younger. And just for comparison, you can see these two rows are irrigated with treated wastewater. And these are 20 years old trees. And look how they look like compared to what you probably know, or compared to this freshwater irrigated tree or this freshwater irrigated tree in the background. So that's the damage to the tree described in visually. And when we measured oxygen in the soil, these two continuous lines here, you can see that the freshwater in blue oxygen levels also, and this is the time from irrigation start in hours, you can see that also in freshwater irrigated plots, we see a decline in oxygen after irrigation. But this decline lasted for shorter periods, only 19 hours from irrigation, whereas the decline in treated wastewater irrigated plots lasted for much longer, 9 hours longer, meaning that the trees reached lower oxygen levels and were retained in these low oxygen levels for much longer. And this is what we believe was the main cause of damage to the trees. So giving an overall look here, black areas signify very wet conditions and low oxygen levels, and you can see the treated wastewater on the right had much longer periods with these wet conditions as compared to fresh water, and these low oxygen levels as compared to freshwater irrigated trees. We linked this to root growth and to levels of sodium that accumulated in the root. And overall, we linked this, we found this correlation between the time below 10% oxygen and the yield of the trees, meaning trees that had longer periods with low oxygen levels suffered from lower yield. So just to give you a taster of what you as farmers can do, we started some experiment trying to find how to correct the damage from treated wastewater. And what we tried was converting to fresh water. We tried low frequency irrigation to allow bigger periods between irrigations for the trees to be aerated. We mixed fresh water with treated wastewater, and we tried to irrigate over tuff-filled ditches. So these are tuff or scoria or pumice, I don't know what you call them over there. But basically we created ditches full of these pumice to kind of aerate the root zone. And just to show you results from Nemera et al. Showing the transpiration of the trees, you can see that while the treated wastewater irrigated trees continued to transpire very little because of the damage to oxygen supply and such things, when we converted back to freshwater, we managed to actually rescue the trees. And also these tuff ditches were quite successful at alleviating the damage. The mix irrigation and the low frequency irrigation were not as successful. And the results on yield were not so successful so far, and we're still looking at the long-term effects of these transition to tuff or to fresh water to see if they actually are useful for farmers. So to summarize, there's going to be a much greater demand for treated wastewater for avocados, I'm sure, because there's criticism about the use of fresh water for avocados. And I think this lecture is very useful for you guys. I hope it was. Treated wastewater is widely used in Israel. It can add nutrients which your plant needs, and these nutrients should be accounted for. And the high sodium levels, when they exist in treated wastewater, may affect aeration, especially in clay soils, and that can damage your avocado trees. And there are some measures to take to prevent the damage from happening. I'd like to refer you to this book produced in Israel by our collaborators, which concentrates a lot of useful information. And to say thank you for listening to me, to all the people that contributed to my work and the funders, and to my family, of course. This is my daughter when the research started, and she's now celebrated 8 years old yesterday. So I owe a lot of thanks to her as well in the whole story.
Thank you very much, David. That was great. And I think even though we may think in California we don't have this issue, I know at UC South Coast Research and Extension Center, we're irrigating with reclaimed water there. And what you showed is something that we've seen, that initially when they switched to reclaimed water at South Coast, the trees actually did a little bit better. And now we're 8, 9, 10, I don't remember how many years down the road. And we see there's an overall decline in the yield. And now you explain to me why I'm seeing a lot more runoff when we go down there to harvest fruit. And if they've been irrigating, you see a lot more runoff. And Ben Faber asked a question about what happens if you plant them on berms. The trees at South Coast are not planted on berms, but what do you think about the idea of having them on berms to increase aeration?
I'm not familiar with that term.
A mound, having the trees on a mound.
Right. So we do plant them on mounds, and I think the place where we saw them suffering the most, the mounds might have not been high enough. So I think as a general rule that is better, but I'm not sure that would prevent the damage there. Yeah. The main infiltration of oxygen would be from the top down, not so much from the sideways, but that could be beneficial as well, yeah.
Thank you very much. So David's going to stay online, so when we finish this next presentation, he'll be around to answer questions.